If Hegel was right, we all would have come through COVID and be like, oh my God, the universal. Yeah. We need the universal. And we would have...
we would have been educated into the universal, as he puts it.
Yeah, but that if Marx is right, then we all come through COVID still wondering why, like, planes are late and why, stuff isn't showing up.
I'm Gil. Here with me today is Will.
Hey.
Lillian.
Hi.
And Owen.
Hey, everyone.
And for today's episode, we're very excited to be joined by a special guest, Dr. Jason Reed. Hey, Jason. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So Jason is professor at the University of Southern Maine, and for a number of years now, he's been one of our most prominent and exciting Marxist philosophers. His first book was The Micropolitics of Capital, Marx and the Prehistory of the Present, where he began his exploration of Marxist political thought in light of the critical investigation into subjectivity found in Spinozistic continental philosophers like 𝙤𝙤𝙧𝙚, 𝙁𝙤𝙙𝙬, and Antonio Negri. More recently, he's been interested in the notion of transindividuality, as in his 2015 book, The Politics of Transindividuality, and his new book, just out with Brill, soon to be out with Haymarket, The Production of Subjectivity, Marx and Philosophy. For today's discussion, we've read a few chapters from this newest book. The idea of transindividuality comes initially from the work of 𝙤𝙤𝙧𝙚, an early 20th century philosopher whose research focused on individuation. Instead of taking individuals for granted as a kind of basic ontological unit, Simondon argued that processes of individuation are more fundamental, which give rise to individuals as phases or states along the way, but in which those individuals serve neither as an origin or an end. This perspective changes considerably the way we understand a number of metaphysical problems, especially the question of the relationship between the individual and collectivities. And then, for the past few decades, Etienne Balibar has adopted this perspective in his own philosophical work, drawing more explicitly political consequences from this idea of transindividuality. It is in this lineage that Jason situates his own research. Balibar and Reed identify a small undercurrent of philosophers of transindividuality within the Western canon, Spinoza, Hegel, Marx, and sometimes Freud. What distinguishes them from others in this tradition is that, like Simondon, they do not take the individual to be a discrete and ontologically primary unit. However, Balibar and Reed argue they've often been misunderstood as making something like the opposite mistake, namely positing the social totality, whether that's substance, spirit, or capital, as absolutely primary, in such a way that the individual then loses all sense and coherence. Rather, we should understand them as transindividual thinkers, who refuse both the individualism of liberal thought and the organicism or holism of the communitarian alternative, instead developing a consistent conception of individuality as always collective, and collectivity as always individuated and individuating. In one formulation I found particularly memorable, Jason writes that the thought of transindividuality involves two theses, that of an irreducible minimum of individuation at the heart of any collective process, and that of an irreducible minimum of the collective in any individual. Adopting this perspective has, as Jason's work shows, a number of striking theoretical consequences, many of which are notable for how they avoid the aporias of more traditional political thought, and he draws them all out in remarkable detail in the book. I want to bring up just three of them here in what remains of this brief introduction. So first, this allows us to reconceptualize subjectivity, a theme that, as already mentioned, is run throughout the whole of Jason's work. The book, of course, is entitled The Production of Subjectivity, and this is, in and of itself, a concept of transindividuality. It should be heard in both senses, the social process by which subjectivity is produced, and the way in which subjectivity is productive, the production of subjectivity. This becomes then a concept with which to understand processes of social individuation and individuated activity, a way to think about conditioned agency that cuts across the traditional divide between base and superstructure. And as always in Jason's work, this thought is closely connected to questions about a possible subject of politics. Second, this approach to individuation and subjectivity enables Jason, following Paulo Virno, to rethink several core concepts of Marxist thought. There are some fascinating discussions in the book about reification, alienation, and fetishism, which take on new senses from the transindividual perspective. Similarly, notions like the commons and of primitive accumulation seem to become more central to the analysis of capitalism than we get in some other versions of Marxist critical social theory. And I'd love to hear more about all of this, hopefully in discussion. And then finally, there's a substantial engagement with the concept, also elaborated by Balibar, of equal liberty, which Jason presents as doing in the political register what transindividuality does in the metaphysical, cutting across familiar binaries by positing the irreducibility of both individuality and collectivity to one another. In more traditional political thought, it's usually taken for granted that equality and liberty are opposed to one another somehow. Freedom is possible only on the basis of some posited inequality, and on the other hand, equality is established only by a restriction of freedom. The notion of equal liberty explicitly refuses this dichotomy, but for this reason, it's also a seemingly unstable notion, and Jason productively mobilizes it in his analysis of some ongoing political struggles. So as you can tell, the work is extremely rich, and I've only sketched out a few of the directions that Jason goes in it. We've got transindividuality, the production of subjectivity, Marxian notions like alienation and fetishism, and equal liberty. So I've got some specific questions that I'd like to ask, and I'm sure the others do too, but perhaps I could ask you to start by saying a bit about how and why you came to develop this perspective, what political or philosophical questions drew you to working on these concepts, and if you'd like to take up any of the threads that I've sketched out here.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I was struck when I first heard the formulation of transindividuality. It seemed incredibly suggestive and productive, and I was also somewhat struck by the way in which it seemed to be operating in different philosophical places and with different philosophers working at it as kind of a not quite shared perspective, because people like Balibar and Virno, who you mentioned, and also like Bernard Stiegler, are working from very different philosophical traditions, but they all felt it necessary to sort of come to this idea and had different understandings. So I sort of was drawn to both its productivity and its like polyvalence, the way it had different senses in different philosophers' works, but it seemed to me that it got at something which is incredibly important, that the binary that it seeks to overcome, the binary between, say, thinking in terms of the individual as both like a methodological as well as a political and moral like position, and the collective as a methodological position. It seemed like the binary that it seemed to overcome was a necessary binary to overcome for critical thinking and for politics. And then I was also drawn by the way in which I think, like all philosophical concepts, it produces ways of looking at, things in the present, but it also, in terms of politics and so on, but it also produces ways of rereading other philosophers and to see the way in which this problem, or a version of this problem, unnamed as such, might be at work in people like Spinoza or Marx and so on. So it just seemed like both necessary and suggestive all at once. So, I tried to sort of work through it.
Yeah, I really loved what you're doing with trans and individuality. In particular, I thought what was fascinating was how it reorganizes how we understand alienation. And so if, the let's say the ontological argument of transindividuality obtains, which is, I take it in the way that I'm thinking about it, is something like the individual doesn't exist prior to society, and, society isn't simply the liquidation of the individual, but actually we share these affects, these languages, these cultures, these political political institutions, and it's only through those that something like an individual is composed. And so the individual is always in relation with others, with other practices, etc. And so alienation is no longer how did I lose myself. That would make sense if something like the individual kind of preceded the social. In fact, what alienation becomes is how I have lost the very grounds of my own possibility. How I am I think the way that you put it is the loss of objectivity for the subject, the loss of the relation to its conditions. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see this this reformulation of alienation? How does it affect how we consider the subject ontologically, but also how might it affect how we think about political practice? Like, so is there a certain type of political practice that emerges if we think of alienation as how did I lose myself versus how did I lose objectivity or the very conditions for me to be a self?
And I think likewise with reification and exploitation, I feel like these other kind of key concepts in Marx, I have the same question Will just asked about all of them. I thought that part was really interesting in your book.
Yeah, well, taking the first one, alienation, which is, a concept that has come under a lot of criticism, for a while now. And I think part of the criticism is because, and the way in which it's sometimes, as you were saying, Will, the way in which it's sometimes invoked, it suggests that the opposite of alienation would be some, fully self-possessed subject, which seems to be a problem both philosophically and politically. And in some sense, this idea is almost flipping the definition of alienation, that the sort of detached pure subject, the opening lines of, Marx's 1857 introduction, the introduction that's attached to the Grundrisse, where he talks about how it's only in bourgeois civil society that you get this individual that sees itself as fully autonomous and independent. It seemed to me that it's more interesting and productive rather than think alienation a loss of self, but alienation is a loss of objectivity, one way to put it, one way I put it, but also relationality in general, the sort of sense that one only exists in and through one's connection to the world. That what capital does is it doesn't so much deprive individuals of subjectivity, it reduces them to a pure abstract subjectivity, that of labor power. And that's the alienation, to be nothing other than labor power, to have no connections to the world, both natural and social, other than what one can gain through one's selling of one's abstract potential, is in this view alienation. So, I think to some sense, I'm always drawn towards, as a Marxist philosopher, I always see Marxist philosophy as an incredibly, problematic path to take, in the sense that it is always a matter of sort of taking these Marxist concepts and wrestling with the way in which Marx himself was not interested in sort of formulating their full philosophical implications. There are multiple different readings of them, and to some extent they are concepts, because they're tied up to the critique of capital, they're concepts which must necessarily be reinscribed and reinterpreted as capital itself changes. And so they're both kind of necessary, but also need constant revision, in my view. And I would say that about about alienation, I would say that about ideology, exploitation, a constant need to return to them and think, what do these concepts mean for us now, given the current state of capital and given the current political and economic situation we're living in?
Yeah, I had an interesting question about that. So you say at some point I think you're talking about Stiegler, and there's a kind of two-sided character to what we want to call the proletariat or working class in capitalism. On the one hand, it's the highest degree of integration and unification and collective cooperative labor as an organized form. This is the development of capital, but also increasing fragmentation and disunity and isolation at the same time. And you suggest that, this might be understood as a historical development, that this is a new phase of the transformation of labor and capitalism. But it also was, if Balibar is right, if you're right about this, always true of capitalism on Marx's analysis. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this. This is interesting because I think a lot of people who read Marx take the historical suggestion more seriously, that once upon a time, maybe in the mid-1800s, there was like a unifying movement of capital vis-a-vis workers, and now it's dispersal or fragmentation. And I think it's interesting to suggest that both of these were always already true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, not to get too like intellectual biographical about it, but like I at a certain point, like theses around like post-operaismo stuff was very influential for me, and that was heavily dependent on a very periodizing way of understanding capital. Like something new is happening with capital now. It's exploiting not just our capacities as bodies, but also our minds and our social relations, sort of argument you find in people like Negri and 𝙁𝙁𝙀 and so on. And then I guess I became very skeptical of that, in the sense that it seemed useful to think about the way in which you can't really talk. And the line that I quote in the one piece, from Marx on cooperation, where he talks about, cooperation exploiting the species capacity, that to some extent, every exploitation of labor is always already social. There is no, and this goes into part of the notion of transindividuality, in the sense that even if I am, working, like on my own, I'm utilizing skills, knowledge, ways of working that themselves don't originate with me and are part of a social process. So even if you're kind of like working some isolated, at home in your own little, your little tiny loom or whatever, in some piecemeal work system, you are still working with ways of relating to the world and acting that are themselves social and produced. So there is the division that I think some people really rely on, the division between a sort of abstract labor as just sort of bodies and abstract labor as now minds and social relations, is not a division that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, nonetheless, I do think it makes sense to still think in terms of periods and shifts, but not in terms of radical breaks. I think it makes more sense to think in terms of tendencies rather than thinking in terms of suddenly something new is happening with exploitation that has never happened before.
So I think this to me just seems like this is one of my moments on the podcast where I just think what you're saying is sort of obviously true. And I'd like to know like what transindividuality helps us clarify, because this is my first time really reading about this concept. So I find myself thinking that what you are saying again is basically true, that there's something wrong with a way of doing social analysis that starts from, whether you want to call it dialectics or kind of social processes, and you're trying to work out their developmental logic. And then over the course of time, at least in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the first, suddenly we're all like not really talking about the processes. We're just like being very impressionistic about like the result that has happened. We're like, oh, wow, we're just doing things so differently now than we were 15 years ago. Let's give it a new name and a new stage. And then we're going to write books with these prefixes. And I hope this might offend a chunk of our listeners, but like I just think this is like the worst waste of time. And what it means is that there's something about the processes that is not actually being understood. That's what it signals to me. And there's like this kind of craving of novelty in the analysis that doesn't appeal to me. And I'm much more attracted to the kind of effort you're making to try to see how to rethink concepts in such a way that we can actually make sense of continuity more than we can breaks. I like that. I'm like bought into that kind of project. What I'm not quite sure about is like how transindividuality is helping you to conceptualize processes, whether in general, like at a more abstract level, or at the particular processes that kind of attach to those Marxian concepts that kind of allow you to like get inside the way human subjects are formed and the way that the system develops. Because it seems to me like that's, unless I'm misunderstanding, that's like what it's part of what you're able to do. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, who are the thinkers that help you? What are the resources? like whether it's Hegel or Marx or Balibar, these kind of figures, Spinoza, like what's allowing you to like kind of flesh out this alternative called transindividuality?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I try to do is argue that I'm trying to articulate what I see as a critical theory of transindividuality, in the sense that, and one of the defining characteristics of that critical theory comes back from that passage that I just referred to earlier from Marx, in the sense that one of the things I take as basic to Marx's critical perspective, and this is also something I find in Spinoza, is that when Marx confronts something like, famously in the German ideology, the notion that, ideas drive and determine history, Marx doesn't just say this is false, this is wrong. He says, I'm going to show you the historical process by which this false, or to put it in Spinoza's terms, inadequate idea comes into being. I'm going to tell you why people think this, right? In a similar way, I would argue that the perspective, which is in some sense predominant, of thinking in terms of isolated and separate individuals, is not only incorrect, but has to be understood as itself a product of capitalist social relations. And that the critical perspective is about not just, to juxtaposing the what I think is true to the false, but showing how transindividual relations can produce, in a kind of, inverted mirror image vision of the world, produce their own sense of isolation, right? And one of the things I talk about in the one chapter that you all read is the phrase, the increasing commodification of the pre-individual and the increasing exploitation of the trans-individual. So here I am going to be a little bit, I know I kind of criticized historicizing perspectives a bit ago, well, like seconds ago, but I'm going to sort of say that I do think there's something to that tendency, in the sense that the very things that make up the basis of our existence come to us in a commodified form, right? That the wealth of capitalist societies confronts us as an immense accumulation of commodities. And that part of that, what that means is that we don't really, we're affected by things without really being able to understand the ways in which they affect us, right? This is just kind of a basic thing of the way I understand like commodity production and commodity sales, is that the whole world we live in is one in which we associate different ideas, like this thing is cool, this thing is hot, this thing is uncool, and we have no real understanding of where those associations come to, because they're produced in us by a whole series of different relations that function by being obscured, right? The sort of Virnow's idea of a kind of black box, right? We don't see the conditions of our own individuation. And there is a version of this, in someone like Stigler, who I think has some points, I'm not entirely, Stigler really thinks that, like, for him, we've completely lost the conditions of our own individuation, right? Because for Stigler, Stigler really juxtaposes, to learn how to read is to learn how to write, right? And for a long time, a lot of things that we learned in our society had that kind of reciprocity to them, right? To learn how to passively be affected by something is to learn also how to actively produce it. And Stigler thinks that this just doesn't happen anymore. Although I feel like Stigler's never seen, well, he's unfortunately passed away recently, not so recently, but he had never seen YouTube or TikTok, because people...
Don't speak ill of the dead. Never seen you.
People, the way in which, or never seen a meme, because a meme is in some sense like people taking things that have affected them, like a pivotal scene or whatever, or an image, and messing around with it and tooling with it. So I don't think that the condition we've been alienated from our pre-individual conditions in a sort of Stiglerian way, where once we went from writing to visuals, we're just passive products of consumer society now. I do think that there is a way in which, and this is where I'm more Spinozist, we always struggle to maintain our activity, even in conditions which entirely just deprive us of any meaningful activity. So I'm not really saying that fooling around with memes is a liberatory practice. It in some sense is an incredibly truncated and limited process, but it shows to what extent we are always trying to get to the side of As I say, the production of subjectivity is two senses. We are both produce, and we are constantly trying to produce things, even if the conditions of that production are very much out of our hands and there's very little we can do, and we just find ourselves, producing different ways to make the timeline less doom scrolling. That still is a kind of production.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say real quick that, also what I heard there, and I know people like William Clare Roberts are thinking in this way. Yeah, agency does exist. We are not, completely determined. It is not as if, especially according to the thesis of transindividuality, as if we are pure effects and we are not also producing effects. But that is far and away, from describing something like freedom or liberation. And so sometimes, I like that you said it's not as if memes will set us free. All you're saying there is that what transindividuality tells us is that there isn't any sort of univocal causality, as if there's simply economic compulsion and people just are dictated by it. But that also doesn't answer the question of freedom. Simply to say that it turns out subjectivity is produced, but also produces. And so I thought that was a really nice point, because I think sometimes we talk a lot about agency, but agency doesn't necessarily tell us much about freedom. Agency almost seems to be just the ontological condition for there to be a world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your response there, Jason, helped me understand the notion of the wanting to do a critical theory of transindividuality. It was very helpful for me in terms of making sense of what I really like about this project, alongside the politics of transindividuality, which is also, I think, obviously connected, but a bit of a separate thing. Because I think that if you look at, the kind of late 20th century thinkers that you could call or classify as kind of trans-individual thinkers, someone like Jean-Luc Nancy, right? There was this left Heideggerian movement to really emphasize the Mit-Sein or being with or Mit-Dasein in Heidegger, and that we're actually this atomization that we live and that we think in is actually it's false, and underneath it is the real true reticulated network of interconnected beings that we are, or whatever. And I've said this before, but my answer to that is always okay, but why aren't we why are we atomized then? If that's the real ontological truth of what we are, is we're trans-individual.
Then why can't we get it?
Then why do we live as just totally commodified, serialized, isolated, atomized, individuals? And that answer isn't in there because
we're being inauthentic.
Because they're being inauthentic, right? We have an inauthentic society now instead of an inauthentic individual, right? And so I really, really appreciate this, because what you do in this book, at least on the critical side, right? Because there you're saying no, the reason is this whole network of this historically determined network of habits, of technologies, of modes, the mode of production, and then not just saying the mode of production, but specific aspects of the way that the capitalist mode of production relates us one to another and individuates us and all that. So I just want to say that I really like that, a critical theory of transindividuality and how and what I think it brings that is different from other, let's say, I don't know, more wishy-washy, more ahistorical versions of that of transindividuality. So,
Owen's trying to be so nice here.
My question though is about the politics part. If I could just, did you want to say something?
Yeah. No. Well, what I was going to say is maybe a little bit cringe, because this is one of the things I love about your guys' show is when you bitch about grad school, because I feel like even though I'm older, I'm not the same generation, but these trends, man, did they last a long? Like talking about Mit-Sein's going to save us. I was there for that too.
Yeah. I caught the very tail end of it when I began my master's degree. The very tail end of it still had waning hegemony.
The long durée is real.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I just think of it. I think of it as a struggle of being materialist in a continental world, right? That's to some extent what I think.
Yeah, and then the other part of it is there's also another struggle, which is being politically attuned in the continental world, which is the other part of it that I want. Where I have a question for you is that it's not just a critical theory of transindividuality; it's a political theory of transindividuality. And these are maybe I'm not supposed to be this glowing, but these are my favorite kinds of texts, right? Where there's an element of critical social theory, and intertwined with it is a political tract, right? A sense of what kinds of praxis, avenues of praxis that are suggested by the social theory like in question. So the way you develop the kind of politics of transindividuality, at least in what we read, it's you do it with reference to Balibar's notion of equal liberty. Right? The notion of the transindividual, what it wins you in the political sphere is, an ability to see the illusory nature of any distinction between liberty and equality, the liberty of individuals and the equality of society or social equality or something. You don't see those as opposed. And so historical praxis, Balibar gives the example of the French Revolution, which he thinks is as much about economic equality as it is about political liberty. Whether we agree with that or not, that's the example. I guess I wanted to ask more, and it might be that it's only because we read parts of the text, but I wanted to ask you more, is equal liberty for you, is that paradigmatic of what the politics of transindividuality looks like? Or, I don't know, could it be kind of subsumed under a larger set of political phenomena or way of understanding movements in general that I guess outstrips or goes beyond just the kind of equal liberty concept specifically?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I want to say about that is that one of the things that interests me, and at first I was very curious about it, as to why, as we've sort of been talking about, that transindividuality and equal liberty kind of traverse the same terrain, right? But why, not only does Balibar use these two separate terms, but not only does he use these two separate terms, he gives entirely different genesis for both of the terms, right? He says, for transindividuality, it's very much a kind of question of a certain kind of, ontology, metaphysics, whatever you want to call it. But whenever he talks about equal liberty, he always derives it from looking at politics, looking at history, basically saying, look, it's a strange proposition. He says, look, contrary to what we said, there is no suppression of equality, which is also not a suppression of liberty, and there is no suppression of liberty, which is not a suppression of equality, right? That once again, this is a similarity to transindividuality. There's no zero-sum game here, right? There's no zero-sum game between the individual and society. There's no zero-sum game between liberty and equality, despite what a lot of political theory would have you say. So I think one of the interesting things about the use of a different term there is that I think that this goes against the sort of attempts, we were joking about a few minutes ago, not just the Mitzvah stuff, but some of the attempts like, someone like Negri on Spinoza, who really thinks that you can directly derive a politics from an ontology, right? Who can say, that we exist transindividually, we're relational, these are kind of ontological things. And I think this is, I agree. I agree that that's an ontology I'm totally on board with. What exists are relations, and individuation can only be understood in terms of relations and so on. All that I agree with, but I don't think necessarily it constitutes a politics. And it doesn't constitute politics for one of the reasons which we're already talking about, that you have to understand sort of paradoxically, and this is the stuff that comes up in someone like Nancy, that isolated independent individuals are themselves a form of a kind of trans-individual relation as well, and that trans-individuation can take on, and this is why I think trans-individuality is useful beyond a kind of intersubjectivity, because it suggests a commonality which is not necessarily recognized, in the sense that one could argue that people across various different places in the political spectrum all have a politics that's framed in some sense from a sense of feeling like the conditions of their existence are very much threatened, that their lives are precarious. But how that is articulated, how that sense of precarity is articulated into a politics, runs the gambit from fascist reactionary versions of that and racist versions of it, very much like we're not going to be replaced, et cetera, to other versions of it. So the common affect and the common sensibility does not translate into a common political position. And this is why I think you need to separate transindividuality as a way of understanding our shared constitution through capital, through everything that's going on. And I'm not necessarily wedded. Equilibrity is one articulation of a politics. You can talk about abolitionism, you can talk about communism, but the becoming political of the shared condition is not itself a pure product of the shared condition, because the shared condition has multiple and even antagonistic ways of being articulated and actualized.
Yeah, that was something that I absolutely loved. What you were talking when you got specific about capitalism. One, I love somewhere in the production of Subjectivity, you talk about how Marx in the Grundrisse says what makes capitalism actually different than other modes of productions is it doesn't really give a shit about the reproduction of particular forms of existence. It's just trying to muscle its way through. And so one way of critiquing capitalism, you might say, well, what does capitalism do? It dissolves our bonds of commonality. If only we could get back to when we were in small communities and everything was transparent, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're saying,
to the Black Forest.
yeah, look, I wasn't trying to name names, but we all know who I'm thinking about, But capitalism is also a form transindividuality can take because transindividuality is an ontological argument. So there is a form of being together that capitalism offers. I think a lot of us are finding we don't like this form of being together, but the argument of transindividuality is not like a romantic argument of saying something like transindividuality equals good social formation. You describe capitalism as fetishizing transindividuality through processes of the market that can lead to experiences of loneliness. But the thing is, you're not lonely as if you're separated from everybody else. You're lonely in the midst of this particular political formation of transindividuality. And so I guess the question I wanted to ask is something along the lines of, so would the political critique be something like, it's not about getting back to our real transindividuality. It's about making the argument of how we are going to be trans individual with one another. And equal liberty is one concept you can use to say that if we're going to be together, if we're inescapably, going to be together, this is one form it can take. But, capitalism, clearly the way it reproduces itself, has other ideas of, the type of political formation it will take. So I thought that was really interesting of weaving together ontology and the politics, but not saying that they are collapsed into one. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I was just going to add to that, because I think you're right, but I think that capital doesn't just, it's very easy to equate capital with the isolated competitive individuals, but I think it's important to say that in this picture we're painting, and I guess we're painting a certain kind of spontaneous ideology of capital, it also has its own understanding of collectivity, but its understanding of collectivity is through this brute force of this thing called the market, which acts on us, but we cannot in some way act on it in turn, right? It affects us, but we cannot affect it. It is a vision of, I think that one constantly vacillates, and you can see this in all sorts of ways, right? One vacillates in capital between, on the one hand, this belief in the individual as sort of all powerful, you just need to figure out a way to work your hustle. You're going to figure out a way to sort of master your own conditions, and you're just going to have to...
culture.
Yeah, exactly. Where the individual is seen as sort of all powerful. So it vacillates from that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it vacillates towards you just have to adapt. These are the market conditions. You have to recognize that this is the world. And so it vacillates between an image of the individual as all powerful and the image of sort of collectivity as sort of abstract, indifferent, and equally all powerful. And to some extent, both of those have to be seen as a failure to, in some sense, make possible any kind of politics, because politics is not about the individual, nor is it about sort of just adapting to structures that dictate and demand how we live. It's about acting on and transforming the very relations that affect and transform us.
So my question was maybe a little sideways, but a few episodes ago when we did Lukács, I asked the group to tell me what a social contradiction is, and I feel that they were very helpful, but maybe not as helpful as Jason could be.
Yeah, she got us, Owen.
I know.
I'm just kidding. You guys did great. But I still find this idea of a social, contradiction puzzling. And I think that the idea of a kind of antisocial sociality, I think is how Will put it. There's a lot of the things that you're saying about trans individuality. It seems to me like it's trying to break down our experience of contradiction under capitalism. And I'm just wondering if this isn't too sideways. I'm wondering if that's you've thought about that, or if that rings any bells for anyone in the group. Like it seemed like there's a kind of a way of looking at things ontologically that is trying to demystify contradictions and say what it is about our conditions that makes it appear as contradictions. And so maybe what I'm really asking is, like, if you take a trans individual perspective, is there ever really a contradiction, or is contradiction only ever an appearance of how we experience ourselves as individuals vis-a-vis society?
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do think that the way I'm thinking about trans individuality is a way to make sense of, or articulate certain sense of a contradiction, in the sense that it is, as we're just talking about, it recognizes that there's not so much the individual versus society, but in the individuation that is thoroughly social, and that what is opposed has to be seen as sort of existing in a contradictory unity of both. And it also, in some sense, demands thinking in terms of what we often are given as sort of the sort of zenith of individuation, the idea that, competition is how we realize our individuation, etc., is actually itself a commonality that can't recognize its own commonality, right? Demanding that everyone act. I mean, that's one of the things I think is really interesting about Marx in general, is that Marx basically says, look, it's capital dictates that you act. I mean, having to do the same thing, having to be competitive, is in some sense a collectively shared condition that cannot be recognized as a collectively shared condition. So it is less individuated than it takes itself to be and appears to be. I mean, I think there are some big questions you asked in your question that I'd have to think a lot more about what it means to think through a notion of contradiction, how I constantly go back and forth. I mean, I think the only way for me to think philosophically is to constantly both think dialectically and anti-dialectic at the same time, to constantly struggle with that. And so I'm not really sure if I can work all that out right now. But
no pressure. Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to ask about that too, about how it is you see this project, and your notion of transindividuality as differentiating from a dialectical understanding of the relationship between individual and collective, right? Which is the kind of originary problematic of the book, right? Because the dialectical notion is that the individual exists through the collective exists through individuals, and that's what it means to place the dynamic relation rather than the relata as the determining force, right? And I see you doing something really similar. And I also see even there's one point, and I might not be remembering this totally correctly, where you suggest that one of the things that liberalism promises is individual liberty, and what it actually delivers is constraint under forms of commodified consumer existence and constraints under the competitive rules of the market. And so so I see dialectical points being made all over the place in this book, and I was just wondering, I guess, what's the anti-dialectical I don't know, the part of the anti-dialectical thrust that you want to bring to bear on that thinking.
If I could also piggyback real quick, and I swear I'm not going to ask another question. I know that's really annoying. But as Lillian was talking and then you were responding, and granted, I am not a Spinoza scholar, so one question I might have, one thing I would muse about is whether there are real contradictions in Spinoza. And so the thought that I was having while Owen was talking is, perhaps there aren't contradictions in the ontological formation of transindividuality, but there are contradictions in the political stance or position you take of nominating something as a contradiction. And I guess part of the way I'm thinking about that is, if capitalism is another form of transindividuality, then it's not quite a contradiction. It seems like we nominate it as a contradiction in the political stance we take towards it. And I think that actually would mean that you are actually rather different than Lukács, where I think Lukács wants to say that the contradiction is an ontological contradiction. And so that was just my musings, not another question.
Well, I think one of the questions, to talk about the anti-dialectical. I mean, I think that on some level, Hegel's idea is, because Hegel too has a very interesting critique of the sort of isolated individual of civil society in the philosophy of right. But he basically argues that the whole place of civil society is a kind of education of this individual, where it begins to recognize that it needs social relations in order to exist, right? It wants the commodities that it consumes to have been like checked for, like, poison or whatever. It wants a kind of social structure for it to pursue even its own individual self-interest, right? Because it comes out, it leaves the family, and it's like, screw that, screw connections, I'm individual self-interest, I'm going out in the world. And it eventually becomes to learn, oh, there are things like unemployment, there are things like being injured at work. It basically learns a sort of version of some kind of need of a social network or social, structure. And I think one of Marx's, this is going back to 𝙁𝙁𝙗𝙗's line that I really love, that 𝙁𝙁𝙗𝙗 says that Marx's entire project was an attempt to interrupt Hegel. And he says that if you read commodity fetishism, it's an point to say, as they say in Maine, you can't get there from here. You can't go from the isolated individual to a recognition of social relations in capitalism. Because what capitalism does is it constantly reifies and obscures those social relations in commodities. I mean, we saw this in our own recent history, the way in which people during, especially the early stage of COVID were like, oh my God, I didn't really realize that like things at stores required people to be there in order for them to exist. I never really made that connection. I just thought they were sort of miraculated on the spot. And now I recognize that people getting sick means that like and the fact that people are still struggling.
What's with these empty shelves?
Yeah, people are still struggling with this notion, to some extent testifies to the Marxist position that, like, if Hegel was right, we all would have come through COVID and be like, oh my God, the universal. Yeah. We need the universal. And we would have...
we would have been educated into the universal, as he puts it.
Yeah, but that if Marx is right, then we all come through COVID still wondering why, like, planes are late and why, stuff isn't showing up, because in capitalism, we experience our social relations through the commodity and do not see or recognize the necessary labor and necessary social relations that are behind them. So that's, to me, I realize this is thinking dialectically, not as a sort of overarching philosophical perspective and thinking one instance of a dialectical transformation, but that's what I mean. Recognizing, and in some sense, I think, historicizing or problematizing that particular dialectical transformation does have questions that sort of roll downhill into the entire notion of a dialectical understanding of sociality is, I think, in my view, always predicated on recognition, which is why Hegel doesn't quite belong. Hegel, I think, there are trans-individual moments in Hegel, but I think...
you point to, like, the I that is a we.
Yeah. But Hegel, I think, is more a philosopher of intersubjectivity than a philosopher of transindividuality.
Yeah, because of the emphasis on recognition as like the sort of guiding thematic or conceptual core that does the work of uniting or not refusing to treat as separate the individual and the communal, but in this highly attenuated form without recognizing the other dimensions.
And he's also wedded to, for lack of a better word, what you call like I can't remember how you put it, but I'm going to say like the bad way of recognizing transindividuality, which is like the state or the community or something that actually ultimately closes off. It liquidates the transindividuality in the other direction than individualism does, right? It liquidates the transindividuality in the direction of like a coherent and like homogeneous social totality.
Right. That it always represents the sort of the immanent relations through a transcendent instance.
Yeah. And you differentiate that from like what at one point you call like activating the trans individual. I don't know. Maybe I was going to ask you if there was a chance that nobody wants to jump in exactly on that. If you could say a little bit more about, and this I guess relates to my other question about the politics of trans individuality.
Right.
You talk about activating the trans individual, like philosophical anthropology that you lay out. You talk about you use the word rendering it explicit. Right, like it's always implicit there, right? Even the fully kind of commodified and marketized individuals that we are under capitalism still exist as trans individual, but it's a way of existing trans individually that, as we just were talking about, we are so bad at rendering explicit. And so, I mean, I guess it would take I guess we'd have to overthrow capitalism to make it explicit, though, wouldn't we? I don't know. Like, you know, even now I'm thinking, like, how the heck could we ever, what would the project of making it explicit look like without
or we
getting
could
rid of...
just refine remember being.
Well, that's true.
Beyng.
Well, it's a verb. Make sure as long as it's being the verb.
We could just be the mid sign. I don't know why you're making this so hard.
As a verb, not a noun.
Write a poem.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, maybe that's not exactly a very specific set of questions.
No. I think it's another way of thinking about. I mean, I do think the Spinozist in me recognizes that we can never fully adequately grasp the causal conditions of our own existence.
Goddamn imagination.
We're always going to be stuck. We're always going to be stuck, sort of imagining them in some way, shape, or form. But there are, I would also argue, you know, better or worse imaginings, and the capitalist one, which is defined by isolated individual on the one side and an impersonal force of socialization known as the market on the other, is a particularly poor one because it leaves us unable, as we repeatedly see, to confront and address some fairly fundamental social but also ecological and natural problems that confront us. So I would say that I do think that I understand, you know, this is another sort of Balabarian element of me. I understand the Spinozist project to be one of a constantly becoming, that's going to sound very delusional, but a constantly trying to become more adequate and more understanding of our social relations, but it necessarily is always going to be incomplete, and we're never going to entirely dispense with imagination. And I think that's a very tricky point to hold out politically, because I think once you say that we're always going to have this ideological dimension, it always either suggests on the one hand a kind of fatalism, like, oh, we're screwed, right, or on the other hand it suggests a kind of an instrumentalization of that imagination, like, oh, we should be the people behind the scenes trying to construct the better imagination. And I think that both of those are wrong. Like, neither a fatalistic, like, oh, we're kind of screwed, we're never going to get this right, or like the sense of like we need to become the sort of engineers of the imagination. I think both of those are bad politics, but I'm not really sure. I mean, I think that the process of politics is a process by which, you know, people have always tried to come up with a figure or a name of a social relation that could be adequately recognized, and they always end up as sort of being incomplete and then started all over again, right?
Yeah. But I liked what you were saying a moment ago too, though, like the fact that there are, and it is, as you said, it's totally Spinozist insight that like the fact of the kind of ineradicability of the imagination doesn't condemn us to being relativists about this, that there's better and worse forms of imagination. And the criterion that you proposed is like a pragmatic one, right? Like the forms of imagination that let us do more, or that let us resolve in a satisfying way these social or ecological kinds of problems, just to name the most obvious, is a better form of imagination just by that very fact. And I think that's a helpful heuristic to avoid the slide into a kind of relativism about inadequacy or something like this.
And also, this offers another really interesting, again, I'm going back to the critical theory part, critical posture towards capitalism, where one could critique capitalism because of its voraciousness, one could critique capitalism because of the social pathologies it seems to create. But what you're saying, and this causes me to become warmer and warmer to a type of Spinozism every day, is that, you know, capitalism structurally requires an inadequate apprehension of the conditions of one's life. And so I think some forms of political realism, I think that they'd absolutely jive with that. They'd say the problem is that social life or the economy has become a black box. Things happen in there, and then there are outputs, and who knows. But, you know, I think that the political side of it is, you know, better and worse forms of imagination is, it seems capitalism is a problem insofar as it structurally requires us to inadequately understand equilibrity. And that is like, I think that is an interesting and novel political component where it's not just arbitrarily we like equal liberty. It's juxtaposing what types of ideas does capitalism allow us to adequately have, and what types of ideas does it cause us to inadequately conceive. And it seems under this constellation of social forces, equality and liberty are always in the relationship of payoff or trade-off, rather. And so the political move is, how can we more adequately understand that, no, equilibrity is something to approach, is a novel way of more adequately, not completely adequately, more adequately understand our institutional relations with one another.
And just, I like what you're saying. I just want to add one thing to it. I think that the real problem is that capitalism requires us to not be able to grasp our own sort of conditions, but it does so in the very name of stripping bare our entire conditions. It's claimed to have no illusion, to have no attachments, as we were talking about a while ago. Like, it has no attachments to any particular mode of life, right? It doesn't really care about particular norms and values. It only cares about producing more surplus value. I mean, this is something that is in Marx, and the way that Marx talks about, like, the difference between capitalism and something like feudalism is that feudalism needs this kind of misapprehension of social existence, but capitalism, the misapprehension of social existence is built into what purports to be a complete stripping bare, the kind of, I mean, this is a different version than what Marx says in the manifesto, and I think what Marx would say later when he starts talking about fetishism, that in some sense the manifesto was wrong. Capitalism doesn't strip bare and force us to confront, hey, the person on the other side of this is just a boss. It strips bare while simultaneously mystifying. And that is particularly pernicious in the sense that it produces a kind of cynical, everyone's just pursuing their own self-interest. This is what's happening. This is what's always has been happening. And in doing so, it occludes the very social conditions that it necessarily produces.
I mean, what's really crazy about this kind of problem of mystification, and I've recently become increasingly convinced of this, that the through line between liberalism and like republicanism and even forms of like critical theory, like a conceptual through line is that the economy is something that is like normatively and empirically distinct, and it needs to be, depending on the persuasion of the theorists, like it needs to be constrained or let loose or settled nicely with others' fears. I mean, like, whatever. But the thing that's amazing about the whole enterprise when it comes to talking about markets across the board is that, like, what people are fundamentally doing is, like, actually that the black box is, like, critical to the enterprise. Like, if you keep it closed, then we can do critique. Like, we need to, like, put it in its place, and as long as we control it or constrain it analytically, conceptually, politically, whatever, then we can engage in critical theory, and it's critical to do so. It's critical to keep it in its box. And I just find this amazing. Like, it's like I'm not sure what to make of it yet, but like in like normative political philosophy and social theory, I just think this is like the overwhelming tendency. So you can like the market, you can dislike the market, but what everyone agrees about is that the market has to have its sphere, its scope, its institutional constraints. And then going inside the market is usually not the move. And therefore, like, we never really find out what's going on in there, which is kind of incredible. So then the way that we talk about domination is like, things just happen. Like, it is just going on. And actually it's so diffuse and so on. And I think that there's something really peculiar about, I'm just kind of supporting your point, there's something really ideologically peculiar about that consistency.
Yeah.
Well, I think that does it for us today. We'd like once again to thank Jason Reed for joining us. So Jason, would you like to tell our audience about where they can find you online or about anything you've got coming up?
Sure. Well, I have a blog at unemployednegativity.com. Where you can find occasional musings and writings. I have, this book just coming out. I'll have a book coming out from Verso next year about work called The Double Shift. So thanks a lot for having me. This has been like fun. It's given me a lot to think about, and
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much.
So much more fun.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming,
so
Jason.
much.
It's great.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link your blog in the episode notes. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Cynthia Pakakerka, M. Crow, Carl Stope, an anonymous ethicist, not a serial killer or anything, just asking questions, Katie Creel, V.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, whatever. V. Lucas Slevin, Victor Williams, IGGRB, Connor Thomas, James Wallace Lee, Paula Mendoza, David De Silva, Christian Olson Toft, Suavocado Jones, Rosenkrantz, Carlos Reynosa, Zach Boffshaver, Andrew Hartwell, and Nope. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and would like to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. In addition, you can support us by buying some What's Left of Philosophy merch, which you can also find through our website. Follow us on Twitter at @LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.